ID in the D in the town all day. ID in the D in the SEA. ID in the D in the town all day. ID in the D in the SEA.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Fabulous Pelton Cast. I'm your co-host, Kevin Pelton.
And I'm Tristan Carcino.
And as always, with the Seattle Seahawks season in the books, we are thrilled to be joined by the man behind RBSDM.com and a favorite longtime Third Pelton brother. Welcome back to the show, Ben Baldwin.
Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this ever since last week when I was reminded that my over-under takes were so bad that you guys needed to get a little bit of pre-roasting in before I was even here to record the show, which is 100% fair, to be clear. I would have done the same thing.
The locks. It was not a great year for the locks, particularly for you and I, who were together on the Philadelphia Eagles under as a lock.
Wow, a lock on the Eagles under?
Prepare to be the number 2 seed.
I didn't remember that one. I remembered 2 other locks that I knew were worse. So that's like my least bad.
Oh no, actually, I guess that's right.
Lock.
We are not aligned on that. I was on an island on the Philadelphia Eagles. It was the other team in the NFC East. It's the Dallas Cowboys that we were aligned on.
I thought I had them too. We all had that, right?
We did all have the Dallas Cowboys as an over. And despite that one glorious moment where long after Ben went to bed, as I was preparing to board a flight to Iceland, the Dallas Cowboys beat the Pittsburgh Steelers, who were also involved in Ben's locks. Despite that glorious moment, alas, because they benched Cooper Rush for the final game of the season to avoid paying him incentives, the Cowboys did not go over. But boy, did you see how good Jerry Jones was in that episode in the Sheridan-verse. Tristan doesn't understand this reference.
I have
He's not
no idea what you're talking about. You lost.
I don't either, but hopefully the listener does.
Jerry Jones outacted John Hamm and Billy Bob Thornton. So it was quite a tour de force performance, the highlight of the Cowboys season for sure. Anyways, that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the Seattle Seahawks, and obviously we got the news earlier Monday before we recorded that they have parted ways with Ryan Grubb as their offensive coordinator. So we'll discuss that. But first, Ben, I wanted to talk about the question that has, I would say, polarized the Seahawks online community, but it hasn't, because everyone agrees. Was this season a disappointment for the Seattle Seahawks?
I think answering yes would be kind of crazy, because like they brought in a defensive-minded head coach to fix their defense, which had been horrible, and that happened. I think, sure, you can be disappointed about how the offense did, but in terms of like how they did, they won 10 games. They actually beat the 49ers for the first time in a long time. They were competitive in many other games. So I think you can definitely see strides being taken, at least on the defensive side. And like, if you're hiring Mike Macdonald, that's what you want to see. So I think if you said, okay, this met my expectations, or I'm fine with it, I think that's reasonable. If you said that's fine, or I'm happy with how this went, I think that's reasonable. But in terms of saying it's a disappointing season, I think if you thought that way, then you probably had unrealistic expectations, and that might describe the Seahawks ownership. But I think they probably met or slightly exceeded expectations.
Yeah, as far as that last caveat, I think that's something we hope to get into with third Pelton brother Mike Sean Dugar in the not so distant future, because he's the one who's been pointing out that he thinks that from the perspective of the front office, that this would be a disappointing season because they fired Pete Carroll expecting to be dramatically better than they were in 2023 and in previous seasons, and weren't. But your answer is basically what I would say about it.
Can I give that a maybe, though? Like, I understand what the record was. What was the point differential, though?
It was close to 0.
Point differential is basically even. A +7. Okay. I mean, it was second best in the division. Fucking Cardinals. Seeing them run from the goal line yesterday really was not triggering at all. 18th in DVOA, +7 in point differential.
Do you know where they were in point differential last year when they went 9-8?
Very bad.
-38.
What were they in DVOA last year, though?
I'd have to go back and pull that up.
I think they were probably higher than 18th, better than 18th in DVOA, if I recall correctly.
It was probably about the same.
And to say that it's a rebuilding year is not exactly right. Yes, Mike Macdonald is new, but this isn't a rebuilding roster, right? when you look at it, it's not like there's this massive core of young players. There's a couple. There are good young players on the roster, but it's also in a lot of ways a very old roster. At the most important position, they're one of the oldest teams in the league. They're about to be very expensive at the most important position. They're pretty expensive in a lot of other places on defense as well. I think you could view this season as a disappointment. I think I might end up coming in hot here on this podcast, and not because of anything that Mike Macdonald did. And I think this season may have been a little bit of a disappointment overall. And I think the roster is constructed extraordinarily poorly. And I think that's the conclusion that I came to after digging into.
That's not the season is a disappointment. That's the team is a disappointment.
I think the season itself went about probably. Again, it's hard to unpack the wins and losses versus the DVOA, but like ultimately, what we should be talking about.
The Seahawks were slightly better in raw terms in DVA, but had a lower rank in DVOA.
Okay, what were they ranked last year?
They were 16th, but had a slightly worse DVOA.
Okay. So, I mean, if the team is apples to apples year over year, I think Mike Macdonald did a good enough job. I don't think it was a massive improvement over Pete Carroll, right? Defensively, because we're talking about, this isn't like we're just talking about Pete Carroll defensive coordinator, right? We're talking about Pete Carroll head coach. And that's what this job is.
But it is a question of if Pete Carroll is a defensive-minded head coach and his defenses are always bad, what is it you'd say you do here? Now, I think we want to come back to that.
There are different sets of skills to be a head coach and a defensive coordinator. And granted, like maybe we're probably not going to be giving Arden Durde that much credit on this podcast for the defense being good. Like, yes, that will go to Mike Macdonald. That should be your focus. Being a head coach also means hiring the offensive coordinator in many ways, right? And defensive coordinator. And understand, this is Mike Macdonald's first year. I'm giving it an incomplete as far as the season, because I don't think it was a disappointment, but I also don't think they definitely didn't exceed expectations. I guess that they met expectations overall.
They did exceed expectations. Like the over/under was 7.5.
But you're talking too much about wins and losses, and
okay,
less
but
about
the DVOA of a 7.5 win team out of 17 games is a lot worse than average. I don't think
that differential too. Yeah.
What was the Pythagorean record this year? It was better than 7.5.
It was like 8.7. I mean, it's still a win better. I mean,
okay.
I guess you could argue maybe that the schedule wasn't as difficult as we thought it would be, but that's the argument you have to make if you're talking about relative to actual expectations of the objective world.
And even then, that they had to play the whole NFC North, which is like the best division in the history of football, and that, like, I think that balances out the weakness of the NFC West a little bit.
Kind of. I mean, just looking at it throughout the season, where they had 2 wins over playoff teams, right, throughout the year. One of those was week 1 against the Broncos, who were still figuring things out. And then the other victory, what was the other playoff victory? Oh, against the Rams. Against the Rams. Like,
one thing we can say about Mike Macdonald's defense relative to Pete Carroll's defense is not as good at defending Jimmy Garoppolo.
Well, Jimmy Garoppolo is a much better quarterback than Matt Stafford, for what it's worth.
But
like
Jimmy
we
Garoppolo
saw
has
the better Rams quarterback. The
Jimmy
Rams
Garoppolo has always been very bad against the Seahawks, like uniquely bad against the Seahawks, and that was not the case.
Clearly a better player.
Granted, they were playing their number 3 and 4 cornerbacks on the outside in this one.
Yes, but they basically didn't have any sort of. They had some okay wins, right? The Falcons win was I'll say the Falcons win was a good win, right? And even the Niners win on the road at the time was still a pretty good win. And the Broncos win, despite the fact that it was week 1, was a pretty good one. Beyond that, the Seahawks didn't win any games that they probably weren't supposed to win overall. They weren't favored. I think they were maybe underdogs in the Arizona game here, if I recall correctly.
Well, they were underdogs in like 9 consecutive games.
Yeah.
And they won a bunch of them. They were underdogs in Arizona, San Francisco, Arizona, all 3 of those.
And Arizona ended up being a worse team than them overall, despite point differential, probably better. The team that should be disappointed is Arizona this year. But I think it was reasonable to expect this team to play better than they played. I don't know if it was reasonable for this team to have won more games than they won, but I think it was reasonable for them to have played better than they played. And the Giants loss is one of the I mean, it's tough. I don't want to be too dramatic, but it was a very bad loss. And the impact of the Giants' loss was felt throughout the season. It was the kind of game that I'm sure Pete Carroll lost some of those games, but it was to a really bad team.
Didn't he lose one of those to New York teams not too long ago? Am I misremembering here? I'm pretty sure there was a loss to either the Giants or the Jets, or maybe both.
It was 2020 where they lost at home to the Giants and that prevented them from getting the first round bye, right?
Leonard Williams killed them in that game too. I remember that. That was 2020. But were the Giants the second pick in the draft that year?
Probably not.
They were 6-10. Joe Judge was their coach.
Oh yeah, Joe Judge. I mean, they lost to the team with the second pick in the draft. That's where the Giants ended up, right? Third?
I don't know that that's necessarily the measure I'm going to use.
They are a bad team, though.
They didn't get to play.
Yes.
They are. I mean, yes, objectively, they should not have lost that game. I think you're getting too bogged down in the wins and losses, and not.
I'm actually trying to not get bogged down in the wins and losses. I'm trying to get bogged down in. They were the third. They had the third pick in the draft. They had the same record. They tied for worst record in the league, though. The Giants, a team that they lost to at home this year. But what I'm saying is that DVOA wise, this team wasn't very good, right? Yes, they won 10 games. We can look at that.
But again, no one thinks this is a good team outside of the Seahawks front office.
Okay.
Like, again, what I told you is they had an over-under of 7.5. They were underdogs in like 8 consecutive games during the heart of the season.
Should they
Everyone
not
else
have been
thinks this is a
team,
rebuilding team, except the Seahawks front office.
So then it's an issue with the front office, though, because the roster is not constructed like a rebuilding team. Sorry, we keep talking, Ben. I want to hear your perspective on this.
I think I wasn't saying much because I think Kevin and I are aligned in our said what we thought, and I support hot takes, and it makes for a good discussion. But the question I was wondering was, does it matter if the front office has unrealistic expectations? And I guess it does if they think they're like one move away and do something crazy where they're like mortgaging their future for something like the Jamal Adams trade. Like if they did that again, then yes, their unrealistic view of where the team is would have negative consequences. But in terms of like how we as fans or people on a podcast see the team, then maybe we don't need to take into account what the front office itself thinks if we don't think their expectations are realistic.
I mean, I think it also matters to the extent that it informs coaching moves. And like part of the reason that I didn't think it was probably worth getting too bogged down in the disappointment question is that, well, what are they going to fire Mike Macdonald? Like, obviously they're not going to do that after 1 year. This is not a Jim Elmore season where they're going to go out and hire someone else, because again, Mike Macdonald did the thing he was supposed to. I don't want to say the defense is like permanently fixed. And, as Ben has pointed out, it's a questionable thing to rely on from a week-to-week basis, but the defense got considerably better, and particularly after they were able to kind of figure out the personnel mid-season. And now, to your point, I think this is a rather young defense. Like, Julian Love is a veteran, but pretty much everyone, and the defensive line, Leonard Williams is obviously much older, but like you've got a really young group at linebacker now. You've got a really young group at cornerback right now. And I think you can feel really good. And then edge with Chenna Nwosu missing basically the entire season. Like that was a really young group that played well. Like,
do you think they're paid like a really young group?
Well,
the defense overall, because you could pinpoint certain players, but right now the defense is not paid like a very young group. And I think that's where
they weren't paid like a very young group last year either, and they weren't good. So that's
sure. But I mean, Mike Macdonald also benefited. The defense was going to get better than last year than this year. Irrelevant. If that was Pete Carroll coaching, the defense was going to get better. All of those players were a year older.
I mean,
all of the young players
2022 to 2023.
Last year they were like bottom 3 in DVOA, right? It's pretty hard to repeat as a bottom 3 in DVOA defense no matter what you do. So they probably would have gotten somewhat better, but it's not even like just regression to the mean. They were a solidly above average defense, which I think is pretty impressive given like they turned over all of their safeties, all of their linebackers over the offseason, and then did the same thing with their linebackers during the season and still had a pretty good defense, especially once they got past the beginning part of the season. So yes, there's the caveat of how much do defensive coaches actually control defensive results? How much can we rely on this year over year? But it was really bad last year, and it was if there was a strength of the team this year, I think it was their defense. The last game notwithstanding, so I'm cautiously encouraged, at least on that side of the ball.
It was the best defensive DVOA of any team that did not make the playoffs at 10th. So, I guess is what you're saying that your question is like, how do the Seahawks get better from here, Tristan?
I mean, I kind of. I don't know if I have a question specifically. I'm just saying I think this roster, as it was constructed, it's tough. I personally think all of the blame is on John Schneider here, more or less. And I am going into this with the perspective that I think John Schneider, basically they chose the wrong guy last year. Not necessarily they say they should have kept Pete Carroll either. They probably should have torn it down completely, because I don't think at this point that John Schneider has earned the benefit of the doubt. And I look at the roster construction in this moment and I'm like, it is worse than it's money wise. I understand that a lot of these players they're going to release, but when you release players, get that money back, there's still dead cap. It's not like it's free to release them.
No, people are always like celebrating, like, look how easy it's going to be to get out of this contract. Okay, so you paid them a lot more for less time for the one season that they played.
And that's the thing that I think is the biggest issue, where it's like, yes, like Tyler Lockett is a very nice example of it. There's a lot of money that's going to come off the cap from Tyler Lockett when he's released, and it's not a huge dead money on the cap, right? But there are players that have big dead money on the cap. Uchenna Nwosu, he was injured. I understand that, right? It's hard to basically say that was a bad move necessarily, but it's still a lot of money. Uchenna Nwosu, Dre Jones, these players are being paid like superstar defensive linemen right now, and what they've contributed on the field hasn't lived up to that expectation. And I'm not sure if anything that they did prior to getting those contracts necessarily was warranted. Also, there's a lot of money that's being thrown around. And so basically, when you're talking about between Dre Jones, Leonard Williams, Uchenna Nwosu, there's so much money on that defensive line. And aside from Leonard Williams, the productivity hasn't been there. So looking back at it, yes, Mike Macdonald did an incredible job, but there's so much of the cap that is going to players, especially next year's cap, and they'll restructure some of these, they'll release some of these players, but there's so much of next year's cap that is going toward players that really haven't contributed to the defense overall. So I think Mike Macdonald got the most out of players who are not being paid very much this year. And if you want to give John Schneider any credit, it might be drafting players like Boye Mafe, Derek Hall, Devin Witherspoon, Drake Woolen, right? Those types of players.
Knight.
And Tyrese Knight, getting production from those players. But if it also requires having Mike Macdonald as your head coach to get that production, does that necessarily make sense? If we're going to assume that the offense is going to be worse because it was year over year, the offense was worse without any real logic to explain it necessarily. You're questioning that.
I think the offensive line is a reason to explain it, but we can dive deeper into that later.
So basically, if you're like, you have to hire this head coach to make these players valuable, I'm not sure if that makes sense either. The roster itself should be a good roster, irrelevant of who the head coach is.
Speaking of dead cap, the other thing is, like, this year they paid Jamal Adams $21 million. They paid Quandre Diggs $10 million. It's like almost $60 million of their roster this year was dead cap. And we can say that given the constraints, they did an okay job building the roster, but at the same time, these are self-inflicted wounds that past John Schneider did to himself.
Yeah, it's funny. I think people still have this perspective of like, oh, there are certain things that, like, the Saints are infamous for pushing money out into future years and things like that with their restructuring. The Cowboys to a degree as well. And people are like, oh, the Seahawks don't do things like that. And it's like, no, actually, they've like pushed a tremendous amount out into future years. And eventually that is going to haunt them. Like, people think, that because of the fact that there's that ability to restructure, that the salary cap is fake. But eventually every dollar you pay gets accounted onto the cap. It's just a matter of which year and when that catches up with you. And the problem with the Seahawks inefficient spending right now is they're not taking advantage of this period when the draft picks that you've talked about are cheap.
Well, that dead money also, like, talking about changing over the entire linebacker room, right? Like, whether it was Mike Macdonald, John Schneider, it's $8 million just gone, right? Of dead money from two linebackers that weren't even on the roster a handful of months later.
So, Ben, where are you at on John Schneider?
I was kind of amazed he kept his job last year, and I don't see any reason to think that we should revise our opinions upward. I think like I guess there's two major strikes against him. One is that the Seahawks have like when was the last time the Seahawks ranked in the top half of pass protection grade or something? I'm guessing it would be 2012. I haven't looked it up, but it's just whether it's philosophically like people keep throwing around the quotes of him like not wanting to invest at the position, but they have invested at the position. They spent a third rounder on Christian Hayes, I think that was his name last year, and he didn't pan out. They like Abe Lucas could have been a hit, but he was injured. I think Charles Cross was a good pick and worked out. And like they have drafted guys, they have I think a lot of day two offensive lineman picks that just haven't hit in a way they hit for teams like the Packers. And maybe it's bad luck or bad scouting over a very long time period, but that's like the one thing that they've really struggled with nailing. And then the other one, which I'm not really sure how to apportion blame or if blame is even the right word, like I think they clearly did not nail the offensive coordinator hire. And it's like so many people were so excited about this hire that like I don't think we ever saw any red flags based on his college performance. And I guess the only red flag would be that he was untested in the NFL. And I think it's not a bad thing to take a shot on those kind of guys. And if you waited until someone was a proven no-brainer offensive coordinator candidate, then he probably would be hired for an NFL head coach already. So I don't think it's a bad idea to take shots on this guys. I just think that it clearly didn't work out and really affected their season this year.
All right, let's take those one at a time because I wanted to talk about this. Yeah, I think that the interior offensive line, because of the fact that they've let so many players leave, most recently Damian Lewis, and have not wanted to use a pick in the first 2 rounds on an interior offensive lineman, that people think they're like, they're treating it as if they're like using undrafted rookies or something like that at the position. Like expecting a guy, Anthony Bradford was a 4th-round pick. That is maybe a little bit borderline whether you should expect that player to become a starter. But as you were saying, Christian Haynes was in the middle of the 3rd round. And one of the things I went to go look at is like who were guys who were drafted around him. Cleveland drafted Zach Zinter as a guard. He didn't play a lot as a rookie, but San Francisco 5 picks later drafted Dominic Pooney, who started every game for them and was good enough that they've like talked about moving him to tackle next season. So I do think it was as much a player evaluation issue as a kind of positional valuation issue in terms of the offensive line. So
when I think you talk about value also, because I'm kind of looking at those picks, 2nd, 3rd-round picks that the Seahawks have made the last handful of years, who they could have drafted an offensive lineman instead also in those places. And it's like, I love Zach Charbonnet. He played great during the end of the season, but Kenny McIntosh also did. And if it's immediately you take those Charbonnet carries and convert them to Kenny McIntosh carries, he was a 2nd-round pick, right? Charbonnet?
Yep.
That is a 2nd-round pick that could have been valued somewhere
What if we
else.
took the Ken Walker carries and converted them?
Both of those players, right? Both of those players are 2nd-round picks, and the actual value that they're getting from them overall is probably about equal from somebody like Kenny McIntosh or from whatever, another player's undrafted free agent that they didn't do. Right? They spent those picks. They've done a fairly good job on drafting in that territory and many of the other positions, right? Like Derek Hall, like Boye Mafe, like I mentioned. They've gotten value from those players, and that's good, but not hitting on any of the offensive linemen yet, as far as we know, has definitely hamstrung the offense overall. And I think
Lucas, if healthy, I think would have been the hit where he was outperforming where he was drafted. Now, how much his health was a factor?
Injury history going in. Yeah, it's kind of like
remember.
It's one of those things.
So.
They probably just got unlucky, but at some point it became pretty clear that Abe Lucas was going to be injured pretty often. Counting on Abe Lucas to be your starting right tackle.
I think it's just that it's been one ongoing injury that they're going to have to manage because if it's a cartilage or meniscus issue, that's a degenerative situation. It's not like an ACL and then a broken foot or something like this where it's a bunch of unrelated injuries. It's an ongoing thing.
But also, teams have to manage for an Abe Lucas level talent injury. Every single team across the league has numerous Abe Lucas level.
Yes, I think the Seahawks overall were not extraordinarily unlucky in terms of health. Obviously, if you look at, DK missed 2 games, but their best players on offense were healthy basically.
And on defense as well.
season. And yes, Uchenna Nwosu would be the one guy you would say, but Devin Witherspoon was healthy all season.
They missed a half from a quarterback, a handful of games from Ken Walker, but otherwise, I mean, Noah Fant for a handful of games. But it was
the George Fant injury is the one I think where they did get specifically unlucky in terms of a cascade, because I think people think of it as, well, like, why didn't they plan for Abe Lucas to be, why didn't they handle the Abe Lucas injury better? And it's like, well, they did. They went out and signed George Fant, who they thought was going to be good enough to start, and he just happened to get injured at precisely the same time.
George Fant injuries have ruined 2 Seahawks seasons.
There you go. You heard it exclusively on the Falcon Cast.
It really is true, right? What year is that we went into the season? We're like, at least there's George Fant, and then he was out for the year.
2016? I don't know. I don't have a good sense of how long ago that was. I'd have to look it up.
Okay, so you also mentioned, are we talking about Grubb now?
Well, do we want to tie up this Schneider decision? I mean, because one of the things we don't know, and like for a long period of time, we didn't know Pete Carroll or John Schneider on some of these moves, because Pete Carroll obviously had the final say, even though he often ceded it to John Schneider, as far as we know, on personnel. And so, that's why I think last offseason and beyond will be instructive in really understanding what role John Schneider plays in these things. But now the coaching staff, where Pete Carroll presumably had pretty complete authority beforehand, like how much role John Schneider played in filling out the coaching staff is something we don't really know. But let's wrap up the Schneider discussion. Like, do you think, Ben, that the Seahawks would be better served with another general manager?
Probabilistically, I think, yes, you can always do worse, but I don't really see any reason for keeping him at this point.
Or it was 2017, for the record, that George Fant was injured during training camp and out for the season.
Because 2016 was like the 6-6 tie game, and he had to come in the middle of that game, right? And that was like the first time that he had ever come in. And then the year after that, we're like, okay, George Fant's going to save us. And then he didn't.
George Fant's injury. This is the second offensive coordinator who's gotten fired, because Darrell Bevell lost his job after the 2017 season.
Wow.
So there you go. Darrell Bevell did nothing wrong.
I just think it is really difficult to look at the roster as it's constructed right now, that John Schneider ultimately is constructed. Again, Pete Carroll may have had some impact in it over time, but we're pretty far out from the Jamal Adams trade now. We're going to be off the Jamal Adams contract next season, heading into the season that we're going into. And the roster overall, there are some good, exciting young players on the roster, right? You could point to a handful of them that we're very excited about. But at the most important position, they're not wrapped up. We have to have a Geno conversation later. And there's not really a person in waiting right now, right? They haven't figured out that problem. The offensive line has been an issue for over a decade overall. And the way that they've allocated money right now is kind of baffling. The Dre Jones contract, to me, and I understand he probably hasn't met expectations overall, but per PFF, I mean, he's being paid like a top 10 defensive lineman next year. And this season he ranked for PFF 155th out of 211 for edge rushers. Like, Dre Jones was bad this season, and it doesn't make any sense to have spent that money where they did, and that is hurting them overall. And again, Uchenna Nwosu, he was injured. It's a little bit different for Uchenna. Maybe it would have made a difference. But you look at some of these contracts and you're just like, what is the logic going into this? How did they get to this place with some of these deals on the 2025 cap? I mean, yeah, those ones going through, like, the rest are probably fine, but so much of the cap is being taken up right now by Geno, which is another conversation. Lockett, they're going to be off of DK. They'll probably restructure. I don't know. And then it's Leonard Williams, Dre Jones, Uchenna Nwosu. And then they're lucky to have been at this place that they're in right now because of some of the young talent, which, again, as far as credit goes, like some of the young defensive players, Derek Hall, Boye Mafe, played much better this season than they did last. Even Reek Woolen, right? Reek Woolen played much better. Is that Mike McDonald getting the most out of this talent? And if Pete Carroll wasn't able to do that, are the players actually that good overall? You know, like, because again, if you have to basically structure, like, yes, the defense was improved, but if you have to structure your entire organization around getting the most out of this young talent, that's probably fine. But also the offense has to be good as well. And you should see some DVOA improvement instead of lateral improvement.
I will say, on a lot of these contracts, Draymond Jones just has not ever in his Seahawks career produced at this level. Like, part of why Uchenna Nwosu's cap hit is so large in 2025 is because they had to extend him to dramatically reduce his cap hit this year, where it's only 7.8 million this year, which
That's
would
still
have
a decision they made, though.
But
It's
I'm saying it's
a
not
decision that John Schneider made.
I agree. But I'm saying it's not an Uchenna Nwosu issue. The contract for Uchenna Nwosu is fair. It's they had to do that to make up for the Jamal Adams mistake.
These are
They're still
all of the
trying to-
mistakes are all they're all in the same bucket, shooting
there's-
around like ping pong balls. and
I
it's
agree that they
John
all
Schneider.
accrue to John Schneider. I'm just saying, don't make this about Uchenna Nwosu. It's
Yeah, fine.
that's fallout.
Sure. But right now, they were the 18th best team by DVOA. They won 10 games, but they were the 18th best team. And realistically, if the Seahawks had made the playoffs, what is the spread in that game? They would have been the 3 seed, or would that have changed anything with the Buccaneers? If it was the Seahawks versus the Rams, do we know? Whatever. They're playing one of the Vikings or the Commanders.
Yeah, they would have been the three seed against the Commanders. I think they'd have a shot in that game, I think.
The Rams are favored to beat the Vikings, by the way.
Well, the Vikings aren't good either. But would the Seahawks have been favored against the Commanders in that game?
I mean, the question is, again, how do you get to like a team that actually is good enough to get to, a conference championship, that sort of thing. And
Yes.
the path to that, if you're not going to have a top quarterback, is you've got to have tremendous elite talent at a variety of other positions. And as we talked about on the preseason pod, the Seahawks had one guy in the top 10 of any of ESPN's positional preseason rankings. Like next year, Leonard Williams should be like the way that he performed that
As long as the
underrated
Pro
him.
Bowl voters aren't voting on it.
But I think it's him and Devin Witherspoon. Like Jackson Smith and Jigba is awesome. I don't
He's
think
close.
he quite gets to a top 10
He's
wide
close.
receiver. And that's it. So, you look at like I mean,
I don't
look
know
at
about
Cincinnati is the other
Charles
team
Cross.
that has had a winning record the last 2 years and missed the playoffs both years, just like the Seahawks. They have the awesome quarterback. They have two guys who, are probably a better receiving duo than the Seahawks, as good as the Seahawks receiving duo is, and a variety. Like they've got all the star talent, and still it's not enough. So, like that's how far the Seahawks are away. I think it's fair to say. So
FF has Charles Cross as the 10th ranked tackle in overall grade. So he's pretty much right there.
okay, that's
I
encouraging.
was looking that up too.
Although the bad news about it is, like, he's developed into this quality of player right in time for you to have to extend him.
Yeah, he's not going to be cheap.
So,
But it's a left tackle. That's good. They wanted one of those for a long time.
right. Okay, let's have the Ryan Grubb discussion. Ben, I think you've been very clear throughout the season in questioning Ryan Grubb. You want to lay that out for everyone. I think you're right that like we came in with a lot of reason for excitement, and unfortunately, a lot of that was not realized.
And it's weird. We talked about this along the season, both in this podcast in the Pelton Cast Discord. Shout out to the Discord, where there were so many things that we liked about Grubb coming into the season, like they used play action and pre-snap motion, and not that those things are like the only good things you can do on offense, but they signal that you are trying to like give yourself a leg up on the defense and trying to give your offense an advantage. And it's so strange to me that like he did a lot of that stuff last year in college and then comes to the NFL and like they either led or were like top 3 in the league in the percent of their snaps that are like no play action, no under center, just like Geno Smith dropping back and passing. And if you look at the offenses that do that, it's basically them and the Bengals, where the Bengals also put a lot on Joe Burrow's plate, but the Seahawks don't have Joe Burrow, they don't have Jamar Chase, they don't have T. Higgins, and it just seems like the Bengals offensive line is bad, but the Seahawks offensive line is probably even worse. So it just did not feel like they're either tailoring their offense to their personnel or trying to use the kind of easy buttons that we know exist in the NFL. And like there's a lot that we don't observe about offensive coordinators, but given what we can observe and the fact that they were much better the last 2 seasons under Shane Waldron with very similar personnel. Last year, the offensive line was also very injured. And we've seen what Shane Waldron has done since, so it's not like he's the model of a great offensive coordinator. I think all of those are strikes against him where I'm perfectly happy to say we tried it, it didn't work out, and now let's look for something better. Probably someone with NFL experience this time.
I'm perplexed for all the reasons that you laid out. Like why he philosophically seemed so different with the Seahawks and with the Huskies is difficult to understand. And I could have believed if it was like just a year adjustment to the NFL, like I wouldn't have been angry if they would have continued with Ryan Grubb, but it does seem like this is probably the safer move. Although I look around at the list of potential offensive coordinator candidates, and I can't say I'm getting real excited about any of the names on this list. I mean, I guess I'm getting excited about some of them, but there's no one, to your point earlier, if there was someone who was a certain offensive coordinator candidate, they'd just become a head coach, I guess. It's the answer.
Well, I don't know if that's exactly true. You don't just like pass by an offensive coordinator, but there are people in the like passing game coordinator ranks, quarterback coach ranks, who are probably ripe for the ability to move up, most likely from the NFL. But that's where they're going to need to be, or somebody who is fired.
Yes, those are typically the options. You're not going to get someone to leave an existing OC job. So sorry, Brian Schottenheimer is not coming back.
Shane Waldron?
I guess Darrell Bevell isn't in an OC job. He's a quarterback coach right now. So they could bring back Darrell Bevell if they so desired.
I mean, Ben Johnson, before he was the hottest coach on the planet, right? He was the tight ends coach of the Lions. He worked his way up. I think you don't necessarily know where you're going to find these offensive coordinators before it happens. And it probably isn't somebody in the building right now, but you can't just point to this like linear, this person is here right now. Now they're going to be here and be successful. It really depends on a number of things. Let me see where Bobby Slowick was before.
Including luck. But I think there's an interesting thing this year. Well, I mean, I think there's two interesting things. Number one, if they're going to really value past play calling experience, particularly in the NFL, like that takes those guys off the table is part of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And
No,
typically teams hire for the opposite of what they've just fired. So I kind of think that's the direction they're going to go. And then number two, there is a place where you usually look for those guys, including Bobby Slowick, and it's the guys who are under head coaches who are also serve as offensive coordinators. And here's the weird thing is like, if you look at those guys weren't that good offensively this year. The offenses that were good are run by defensive coaches or special teams coaches in John Harbaugh's case.
Everyone wanted Slowick as their head coach, and then their offense just completely bombed this year.
Yeah, we're just kind of like, that's a fascinating what if that I wanted to address. Like, if Ben Johnson was off the table a year later, is there anyone you would have rather hired than Mike Macdonald? And is the answer Dan Quinn with Cliff Kingsbury as his OC?
I think I'm all about Cliff Kingsbury.
It's hard to argue with the results.
No, I think if they were able to find somebody like, I don't know if there's another Cliff Kingsbury out there, but if there's somebody who has had, and he coached in a playoff game, right?
Doug Peterson is the
Doug Peterson, Shoreline native. Like, I don't think he's probably going to take an OC job, but if he was going to take one anywhere, I guess it would probably be in Seattle. So if we're looking at coordinators with NFL experience, Clint Kubiak is going to be one of the hot names. He presumably, like Shane Waldron with the Seahawks last year, will be collateral in the Saints making a coaching change. I don't know if you have any particular Clint Kubiak thoughts, Ben.
That sounds great. Their offense was amazing for how injured they were the entire season.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of competition for Clint Kubiak. The guy that I boldly predicted, and I'm feeling good about my bold prediction, is Mike Kafka. The part of my thinking there was that the Giants, it was reported they were going to retain Brian Daboll, which they made official today, but they're probably going to have to make some sort of changes to the coaching staff under him after this. And again, the Seahawks interviewed Mike Kafka twice for their head coaching position, asked to interview him as OC last year, were blocked. If he comes available, he seems like the logical choice, even though the Giants were whatever they were in offensive DVOA this season. They were bad enough that we consider the loss to them one of the worst losses. Tristan called it one of the worst losses in franchise history.
I don't know if I exactly said that, but I honestly can't think of a worse one. I'm sure there have been, but Todd Monken, like if there was a person like that who's had both, NFL, it's a lot of college, but like Todd Monken was around. There have to be other coaches who have that similar level of experience who are ready for the job.
Chip Kelly.
Yeah.
I just don't really see why Chip Kelly would leave Ohio State at this point. Like the difference between college and NFL, Chip Kelly has a better job than the offensive coordinator for the Seattle Seahawks. How about that?
But he's under an offensive-minded head coach, so he probably would have, to some degree, a greater degree of
Are
autonomy.
you aware? I don't know if you've heard this. Chip Kelly coached Ryan Day in college. Are you aware of that?
I do think there is a greater degree of
I mean, I would be
control and credit.
very happy about it. Honestly, if Chip Kelly was the guy, I would be fine with that overall. I could we just talk about Ryan Grubb though for a second? It
Well,
just
we were
doesn't
trying
make
to.
sense.
You didn't jump in.
It doesn't make sense overall. And we kept asking,
agree.
where's the motion right now? And I think the issue was, I was actually pulling this up when it was happening, is college football FPI, right? Efficiencies. Let's look at the best offenses across college. Offense efficiency, Alabama actually was quite bad. Wait, is that wrong? They were 20th in offense? I take it back. I thought Alabama's offense was actually good this year.
Ryan Grubb might be riding in to save the day there.
Well, yeah, I think there's maybe a chance, but he wasn't calling plays with UW. Is that correct? Kalen DeBoer is still calling.
No,
plays.
he was calling plays.
For how long?
I believe Grubb took over. I think when he became the head coach, he ceded play calling duty to Grubb. But
okay,
I'd have to go double check that.
It still sort of feels like it was a big leap for Ryan Grubb to go from college, this particular leap, because of where he was. Different than maybe some of the other people, because the scheme and the system is still pretty uniquely Kalen DeBoer. And I think that was the issue. It's one thing going from, say, Shane Waldron and Sean McVay's system, but to go from both the leap from college to the NFL and then to the much bigger job, I think it was maybe 2 steps too much for Ryan Grubb. There was reason to be excited about it. He literally just didn't call plays the way that he did in college. And I think that was the biggest issue overall. But I do want to take up, I was looking at the post, and I know we don't acknowledge these people, but people who are like, and granted, he got a little pass happy overall, I think, and put too much on him. To me, the issue with Ryan Grubb was not that he was passing too much. And I think that's when I saw this firing and I was like, okay, like I understand it. I know it wasn't good. I just don't want the opposite of Ryan Grubb, and don't want somebody who the idea that they were just, okay, if Ryan Grubb was not putting his team in the best position because he was passing so much, defenses never had to respect the run, then the Seahawks would have run the ball effectively, right? By that logic, the Seahawks would have run the ball effectively. But they never ran the ball effectively. A small handful of games, and it was better with Charbonnet and McIntosh than it was with Ken Walker. But this idea that he passed the ball too much, and that's why he's fired. The issue with Ryan Grubb is that he didn't run anywhere near enough motion. He didn't run enough motion, didn't run enough play action. He didn't put the team. It was always, let's wait for the offensive line to get better. Maybe that was an outside perspective, but it was like, those are the things that can put you in a better position by having a bad offensive line, is giving yourself an advantage, right? And that to me is what Ryan Grubb did wrong, is he didn't do the things. He didn't take the advantages that you have in offense, right? Which is being able to have that kind of pre-snap motion. It was baffling that it happened this way.
They
it really
use
didn't
a
make
high
sense.
number of at snap motion, I would say, relatively speaking.
Do you have the percentages, Ben, of?
I don't. It's Seth Walder is the one that always tweets those. If anybody has a ESPN connection here.
Who can imagine who would know?
Yeah.
Would know? My colleague Seth. Yes, I did not think to ask about that before the pod, but I don't think it was more the play action in particular is the issue to me, where that was just curiously missing. It's a hack. It's the secret to good offense, and they just didn't do it. And
the other issue with their play action, I watched some of Matty Brown and Griff. They have this, it's the Seattle Overload podcast, and they were looking at like the kind of micro issues with the offense, and they highlighted how the looks that they run the ball out of and the looks that they use play action out of are not the same. So like they showed all these examples of like them doing play action and linebackers just not reacting at all because they were doing play action out of a look that they like had never shown on tape that they're actually going to run the ball from. And like even setting aside the percentages of play action, which is bad, like it also sounds like he did not do a good job of marrying the presentation of the run game to the play action looks off of it. So it seems like it was just like there's a lot of different issues that contributed to this.
All right, should we talk about some other candidates?
Yeah.
Ben, should the Seahawks bring Shane Waldron back as offensive coordinator? That grass was not as green as it looked on the other side.
He's a proven NFL offensive coordinator. I thought that was like one of the big question marks going into the season. They had a proven successful offensive coordinator at the NFL level. They moved on from him. It didn't work. So yeah, bring him back.
And as
Who
a
is the
reminder of
most
the timing,
important player on the offense? Who is the most important player long term for the Seattle Seahawks?
Jackson Smith and Jigba.
We should not bring back Shane Waldron. There's one player that matters. Literally
Charles
one.
Cross.
Yeah, those two. Okay, fine. There are two players who matter, and one of them does not like Shane Waldron.
It's still the
That's
biggest.
fair.
If we talk about play action, is the biggest Ryan Grubb mystery. Why Shane Waldron was treating Jackson Smith and Jigba as if he was Percy Harvin or wait, who's the returner from college? LaVisca Chenault. Like, still difficult to understand. Turns out that the guy who like had the greatest Rose Bowl receiver game ever is capable of running routes down the field. Who knew? Shocking. All right, some other names that I have down. Another person that they interviewed for head coach last year, like Mike Kafka, not coming off a strong season for his resume, is the Dolphins offensive coordinator Frank Smith. Someone who's worked with Darrell Bevel, oddly. The hottest candidate will probably be the Lions passing game coordinator Tanner Engstrand. He may just replace Ben Johnson if Ben Johnson goes and takes another head coaching job, which it sounds like he probably will this year. If Mike McDonald wants to go for someone from the Ravens tree, which easily number one in offensive DVOA this year, and obviously it's a group he's very familiar with, their quarterback coach T. Martin.
Oh,
Okay. Yes, that'd be fun. There were no black offensive coordinators in the NFL this season.
I was actually thinking about that earlier.
Yeah, very troubling. But some passing game coordinators, I think, that have a chance to get promoted in the next couple of years here.
T. Martin's been an offensive coordinator before, also, right?
At the college level?
I thought he was at the NFL level.
No, he's not been around that long.
I guess only at college.
Just in college, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, T. Martin didn't play that long ago.
I
guess he
year
kind
do
of
you
did.
think?
He's substantially older than Mike McDonald. It is true.
20 years ago. It's not that long ago.
But not long enough for him to be recycled as an offensive coordinator quite yet.
Where's Byron Leftwich at?
That's a great question. I don't think I don't know. Out of the league this year. So there you go. I mean, I guess the main thing to remember here is, again, I sort of alluded to it. If they would have hired Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury, it would have been like the 0th percentile outcome in the view of the Pelton cast. And that group led the Washington Commanders to 12 wins and Jaden Daniels to one of the great all-time rookie seasons by a quarterback. So always regress your opinions to the mean.
I'm still not sold on Cliff Kingsbury. I think it's possible that Jaden Daniels is just extremely good.
Possible. We were looking up yesterday how much better DeMond Williams Jr. was as a freshman at UW than Jaden Daniels was as a freshman at Arizona State. So I hope that's the case. Anything else on offensive coordinator? All right, let's have the Geno discussion. Where are you at, Ben?
Since the offensive coordinator discussion wasn't enough of a downer. Last year I completely understood sticking with Geno Smith, even though like he's an average starting quarterback, which is like it's good. There's only 15 quarterbacks that are better than average quarterbacks on the entire planet. So like you could be doing a lot worse. But at the same time, unless you have an incredible supporting cast / set of play callers like the Lions or Vikings, then you're just probably never going to be in contention. I thought that was fine last year because it would have been a lot to completely turn over at quarterback and head coach, and it's just a lot of change at once. So I thought it was completely reasonable to see what things looked like with Mike McDonald as head coach and Geno Smith at quarterback. I'm a little bit less inclined to go that direction after 1 year, and it always feels kind of like jumping off a cliff if you're swapping out a starting level quarterback and there's all this unknown of what would replacing him look like. And actually, everyone says the class of quarterbacks in the draft this year is terrible. So maybe it's not the best time to try to upgrade. But at the same time, we've had 3 seasons of Geno Smith. Their record is very close to exactly 500. Their point differential's very close to exactly 0. And there are problems with the team that aren't Geno Smith, but he's not a quarterback that's going to elevate you somewhere else. And he's in his mid-30s, so it's not like he's going to be like the super long run option. So I am in favor of overturning every stone you can to try to upgrade at the position.
I mean, it's mostly like to try to upgrade long term. I mean, in some ways,
Yes.
maybe one of the advantages of moving on from Geno Smith would be, well, Geno Smith is probably not going to play poorly enough for you to get a high draft pick to take a quarterback. So if that's one of the avenues, then he sort of precludes that by giving you this high floor in addition to a limited ceiling. I I mean, realistically, they would have to trade Geno Smith. Cutting him would make no sense because at 31 million, which is I think basically his non-guaranteed salary plus the roster bonus, etc. Like that would be worth it for another team to get a starting quarterback without question.
Yep.
So if you could get like something real for him, like a day 2 pick, like that might change the conversation to me a little bit. I think I would probably be somewhat more inclined to just draft a quarterback and play things out with Geno one more season and get additional information. But where are you thinking, Tristan?
The additional information thing, like I don't.
The additional information being knowing about the quarterback,
the other
drafted,
quarterback, not on Geno. We're not just like, well, we'll see what we got in Geno.
And maybe to a degree, finding out what you have in Jackson Smith and Jigba and DK Metcalf long term, like how much is JSN going to grow next season? That I think question is relevant as well.
And your offensive coordinator too. It's probably easy to know if you got that hire right if you actually have a quarterback.
I think that's definitely the avenue, is give Geno a year with a more proven offensive coordinator and an offense that is ultimately going to look fairly similar to this year's offense. I don't think there'll be any massive turnover for this year's offense. Hopefully, at least one more weapon added, something like that. There's definitely going to have to be some wide receiver addition of some kind. The number, if he just stays around, he's the 8th highest paid quarterback in the league next year.
That wide receiver addition is more Bobo.
Bobo's a great number 4 wide receiver.
I think he would be an adequate number 3 receiver.
I'm skeptical about that. But Geno's the 8th highest paid quarterback in the NFL in 2025. He's
8th highest cap hit, right?
Cap hit. He's not necessarily they're not going to have on the field value that exceeds that cap hit. But also, you have to field a quarterback. And if he's the 15th best quarterback, 16th best quarterback, and he's being paid like the 8th highest quarterback, honestly, that's not that bad. There are definitely worse outcomes than that. And people could be like, well, why don't you just draft a young quarterback or whatever? But to have a young quarterback have that kind of value, either you need to get extraordinarily lucky, because again, if you look at your EPA plus CCO composite
yes,
on there, all of the rookie quarterbacks aside from Jaden Daniels were bad this year. And every team was fairly happy with those rookie quarterbacks long term, but those quarterbacks are being paid fairly high to have a season where they were not anywhere near competing for the playoffs, right? Of those first round quarterbacks.
Broncos?
I guess Bo Nix also. He was about average, right? Bo Nix was about average.
Oh, I mean, they did compete for the playoffs, right?
Yes. No, they made the playoffs. You're right. You're right about that. So you do have Jaden Daniels,
but primarily on the strength of their defense. Now
you do have both of those players as players, and Michael Penix. They're not quite as young, and they're not extraordinarily cheap. So it's kind of difficult to just say like, oh, just go draft a quarterback. I think what you're talking about, Kevin, though, is honestly, it's kind of the only avenue that they have right now. Yes, they could trade Geno. I don't know what the demand would be for trading Geno. Probably
I don't know if it's the only avenue. So if I were to outline an alternative path, if they were to take Ben's direction, I think it's again try to trade him. Kirk Cousins presumably is going to get released. Sign him and pair him with a rookie quarterback, because obviously Kirk Cousins is very excited about that potential, but not someone you're taking with the 8th pick.
Oh man, I'm now almost talking myself out of this if it means watching Kirk Cousins.
They're not going to do it. That's not Kirk Cousins. Things would have to change for Kirk Cousins physically for him to be an NFL starting quarterback.
That seems a little harsh.
We're talking about like some of the lowest mile per hour throwing in like recorded history from Kirk Cousins last season.
What if
And
it was Aaron Rodgers?
Oh dear, I've got bad news for him when he finds out about the state of Washington.
I think I know you say you hate when they say have to, right?
I do
But
say that. Hate that.
I think the only obvious thing to do here is to look at one of the quarterbacks who's a little bit lower in the draft. If we're assuming Cam Ward and Shedeur are going to be picks 1 through 5, something like that, top 10 picks before the Seahawks are drafting. I don't know if I'm sold on either of them anyway as quarterbacks. And it's everybody else. And the Seahawks rounds 2 through 4, figure out who they like the most, find the place to select them. Maybe they trade down in the first round and get 2 second-round picks, something like that. Or second and a third, something like that. And they draft a quarterback. But I could see them, the more that I've thought about this, I boldly predicted Jackson Dart. And Jalen Milroe is not Lamar Jackson. I could see them viewing Jalen Milroe as somebody who they could build around right now. And I've thought about this a lot, and it's kind of like he would be starting by the end of the season, I think, if they drafted a quarterback in the second round. That's just the way it goes. Those quarterbacks find their way into the field. But one more season of Geno Smith at the number that he's at right now, you're off of it after. You have a lot of flexibility in 2026, the Seahawks do, right? 2025, they don't have very much flexibility. They have quite a bit more flexibility in 2026 overall.
Depending on how much they push to 2026.
There's going to be some, but I don't think it's going to be like an obscene number.
I guess, by the way, the other thing on Geno Smith is how is he going to handle it if the Seahawks try to play out the season without an extension? Because clearly he's going to push for an extension, understandably so, as he should. You know, if he threatens a holdout, that sort of thing, how does that change their philosophy, by the way? So
I think he collects his $44 million and is happy.
But again, you keep saying $44 million. Geno doesn't get all $44 million.
What is he getting personally in pocket?
Well, on March, 9th or whatever, the 5th day of the league year, he's going to get the roster bonus, which is, I believe, $16 million after the escalators. I'd have to double check this.
I think it was $16 million. Yeah.
I think I dropped this page, but
yeah, it's 16.
So then after that, he's got a lot of leverage because his actual salary in 2024 for playing the games is not that high.
It's the 14.8 million.
Yeah, it's like $1 million per game or less than that.
I still think if you're Geno Smith, like Geno Smith is still being paid. He's punching above his weight right now as far as contracts go.
You saw we want to talk about Kirk Cousins. He had the most severe injury you can possibly have.
Yeah, but
and
everybody
signed the contract that he did.
Widely considered to be a horrible deal. Like just because he signed it, I think people may have learned from Kirk Cousins. He's gone. The Falcons
I don't think people ever learn in the NFL, and understandably because, like, yes, when you have the approximately 16th best quarterback in the NFL,
what if it
doesn't seem that exciting for the Seahawks?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd rather find the next Sam Darnold personally. I don't know who that is.
That's Geno Smith.
No, Geno was the Sam Darnold before Sam Darnold. He found him.
Zach
to
Wilson.
John Schneider's credit. But if you have the 30th best quarterback in the NFL and he's not young, all of a sudden the 16th best quarterback looks amazing. Brock Purdy trade?
I'm for it.
I did want to have a Geno Smith conversation, though, about just his performance. His interception rate skyrocketed this year. And it's odd because of the fact that Geno also completed percentages at a historic rate. If you look at it since the year 2000, there have been 19 quarterbacks to complete 70% of their passes in a season. Geno had the third highest interception rate among those 19 players, behind Baker Mayfield this season, which is interesting, and then Joe Burrow in 2021, which was a career high. He's never been close to that again. Like the relationship between completion percentage and interception rate is not as strong across all quarterbacks as I sort of expected it would be, but there is some. And I do wonder, is this a case where the Seahawks missed Pete Carroll and his emphasis on avoiding turnovers? Or was Geno just unlucky when you look at his turnover worthy throws or whatever the PFF charts? Or some combination thereof, because it certainly seemed like those kind of like once you get above a certain threshold, everything's the same level of turnover worthy. Some of the ones that Gino was throwing were like, there is an 85% pass chance this pass is going to get intercepted. It's only if someone completely straight drops it, it's not going to. What did you think about that, Ben, as someone who has studied this extensively?
Yeah, it is interesting that his turnover worthy play rate was so out of line of what it was the last 2 seasons. And the turnovers were it wasn't just like it got to be third down and he had to push the ball downfield, and as a result, that's when the turnovers came. Like the as we've talked about here, the pick six in the Rams game was on that was first and goal, right? It wasn't like he had to force something. And there were a lot of weird moments this season where it just like he has like a brain freeze or something and just does something completely crazy and out of line with how he plays the rest of the time. And the high completion rate doesn't surprise me because like we said before, their whole offense was dropping back in shotgun and not using play action, and a lot of that is like 3-step drop, quick game. You're hitting your back foot and you're getting the ball out really quick, and those are high percentage passes that aren't going to lead to a lot of explosive plays. But it is also strange that there's a high interception rate off of those, and maybe it's the case that the plays with interceptions weren't necessarily those plays. I'd have to go back and see like which types of plays the interceptions were
A lot in
on.
the red zone, a lot outside the
Yes, a
pocket.
lot in the red zone. And I think red zone has been an issue for him in the past, and that maybe that's like the one common thread across offensive coordinators is he has had trouble in the condensed space of the red zone.
I think a lot of common threads, like even going back to Russell Wilson, like to your point, yes, there were a lot of those kind of fewer deeper shots off of play action. But again, Gino was fourth in CPOE. This is a completion percentage over expected based on the types of throws. Like this is something that the Seahawks have always been good at, no matter who plays quarterback. Obviously, it's only two different guys, but it's very bizarre that has just completely carried over, despite all these different offensive coordinators and two different quarterbacks. So, I don't know. Gino's season, interesting.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. I don't think I would just again, if the Seahawks go into next year with a new offensive coordinator and a relatively similar roster overall, I would expect them to win 10 games again.
I mean, I would expect them to win fewer because they only have. Well, I guess actually no. Most teams, it's a bad sign because you've got the 8 home games. But Seahawks, that was the thing I wish I didn't look up. Has any team ever won as many road games to the Seahawks and not made the playoffs? Like, there's no way that possibly has ever happened. Has it?
I don't think so. I did think I do think I saw that it hadn't happened before.
Okay. Also, should the Seahawks consider signing Russell Wilson as a free agent?
I think I'm good.
Wow.
All right, should we do percentage chances of returning?
But I just want to say on Gino really quick. I'm not sure if these are things that are necessarily going to repeat themselves with a different offensive coordinator and scheme. I mean, you can kind of see just the difference between the sacks were brutal. You could blame the offensive line. I don't know if the offensive line was that much worse this year, but some of the third down sacks that he took at some point that kind of just had to be on Ryan Grubb, like the amount that he would drop back on third and anything. And it felt like pressure was getting there quickly. We got to a place where it's like, this is a play design issue at some point, more than just personnel. So I will be positive and negative because there were positives from Gino and the Ryan Grubb system. You talked about the completion percentage and everything. I think the yards was the highest, highest of his career, right? But the picks and the sacks were brutal and they were crushing for the team overall and the offense overall. And it'd be easier said than done to just get rid of those things. But I do think a new offensive coordinator might be able to kind of split the difference. And if those things, if they are, the offense was good the previous 2 seasons. If you literally took the Seahawks offense from the previous 2 seasons and paired it with the Seahawks defense from this season, you've got a 12-win team.
I mean, I suppose so.
You don't agree with that?
I just think it's like one of those things. It's like with the Seahawks. One of the things I was thinking about with Grubb is that it's funny that people were upset about, hey, under Shane Waldron, the red zone offense and the third down offense isn't good enough, and then they hired Ryan Grubb, and they still weren't good at those things, and they were bad at the things they were good at under Shane Waldron. People always think it's like, well, if we take the good stuff and keep it the same, and then fix the bad stuff, then great. But often it's the case that you know usually it's not that you get rid of the good stuff and don't fix the bad stuff. Usually they all just kind of meet in the middle.
There can't be that many more things that go badly. No, I think that with a little bit of tweaking, I think this offense can get to the place that they were 2 seasons ago.
I also think like I agree with that, but I just don't think it would translate to as many wins as you think it does, because their point differential probably wouldn't, under wouldn't would still be at like a 10 or 11 win level. So
sure.
And the
I'd
NFC
take
West will
that.
probably be better next year with the Niners, unlikely to be, this injury plagued again.
The NFC West will be better. They're playing both of the South conferences, right? The AFC and the NFC South, which are, we'll see. To me, the NFC South looks kind of awesome next year, but still probably 2 of the weakest divisions across the NFL. So they're going to be helped by those. The problem is the rest of the NFC West is also playing those divisions. And you could kind of look at all the teams across the NFC West and say they're going to probably, like, I think Arizona, maybe point differential wise, won't be better next year, but record wise probably will be better. The 49ers almost certainly will be. The Rams are the only team that you would expect any sort of regression record wise year to year because of the schedule that they're having to play. So, but honestly, if they win 10 games next year, they're probably in the playoffs. And if they win,
they got unfortunate this year.
If they win 10 games and they do it with the quality of a team, Pythagorean record of 10 wins, then all of a sudden we're looking at it and we're saying this is a pretty solid roster. We see where Geno is playing after next season and who's there behind him. And you might say, okay, you could transition this to a new quarterback who has a year in the system. Everything else is in place, or at least, in some sort of relatively nice place. Like, you want that quarterback to be playing with the players when Devin Witherspoon is going to be in his prime in 2 years, right? Boye Mafe is going to be in his prime in 2 years. Charles Cross is going to be in his prime. I think they're a 2 years away team overall. And it really just is, who is the quarterback on that team in 2 years? It's probably not Geno Smith, but can they take a year to try to build that player up?
All right, well, let's consider now the percentage chances of various players returning. The Seahawks have very few free agents this year. That's one good thing you can say about them. They have negative cap space, which is why
no money, but
a variety of players under contract on this list. But so it's not as long a list as last year. All right, we start with Geno Smith. Ben, as usual, you can start us off here.
95%.
Are we not going to come back to this list? Can we agree that we're not going to come back to this and add up percentages after?
What do you mean? Of course we're going to do that.
Because I don't want to do it where I'm trying to game the system.
That's the accountability.
With zeros and 100s.
That's not how to game the system, though. Fun fact. I mean, I guess it is when there's this few players.
Because whatever. I think there is also a 95%. I'm going to say 90% chance for Geno.
We haven't talked about Mike McDonald's comment that, like, there's no reason for me to say no about when asked about it on the Brock and Salk show on ESPN Seattle. I think people are reading way too much into that conversation. I guess I will take the lowest number of this group since that's the advantage I get by going last. So I'll say 85%.
So you're gaming the system already. There's no reason for me to say no. Is such a fascinating way of putting it.
I mean, I think people are forgetting how non-committal that Mike McDonald was about Geno throughout all of last offseason leading up to the draft. And it turned out to mean absolutely nothing. Or maybe it meant everything and it just didn't fall into place. Who knows? Don't pay that much attention.
Maybe they were going to draft Penix. Maybe if Penix was there, they would have drafted him.
Maybe Ryan Grubb would still be here. All right. Tyler Lockett, we've talked about this. It's a $17 million cap savings. They'll have to decide on him before his $5.3 million roster bonus is due March 18th per over the cap. Obviously, he's not going to stay on his current contract, but do we think that he might return on a different contract? Has said that he wants to play another season.
This feels kind of like the Quandre Diggs decision last year. that I think I got wrong. I thought he was going to stay. So I'm going to learn from my mistakes and I'm going to say 20%.
I'm going to say 0%.
0%. Wow. We'll see if Tristan has gamed the system. Or if he feels like we feel about our locks. I'm gonna say 25%. I do think they value his veteran leadership, and he might be willing to take less money to stay here in a different way than, even someone like Bobby Wagner over the last few years, given his real estate business and everything else he's got going on in Seattle specifically. All right, this is a little tricky one. DK Metcalf, entering the final season of his contract, will be looking for an extension. I don't know that people are like thinking about this on the same level, but there's a chance. Ben?
I'll go the Geno Smith route and say 90%. What did I say for Geno? What?
95.
95. I'll say 95.
100%.
All right, I'm gonna say 80% on this one.
Okay.
Noah Fant, they would save $9 million against the cap by letting him go. Missed him, I think, in the passing game when he was out this season. But then AJ Barner did step up as a receiver over the course of the season, although I don't think enough that you'd feel confident with him as a number one going into 2025.
Yeah, I don't think he's worth the money. A lot of tight ends are replaceable, and I think he probably fits in that category. So I'll say 40%.
Wow. I'm going to say 85% that Fant return. I love AJ Barner also, but I think Fant comes back. They just roll it back for one more year.
I'm going to say 65%. I'll split the difference here. Jaron Reed.
For that one, I think it really depends on who they end up with in the draft. And I wouldn't be shocked if the Seahawks drafted a tight end with that first pick. There are a lot of other needs, but if it comes down to the best player on the board for them is a tight end whenever they're picking, and they selected somebody who was more of a pass catching tight end, I could see them obviously just releasing Noah Fant at that point and saving some money while they're doing it with that pick. But right now, without that knowledge, there are just so many other needs on the team overall that I don't think they'll draft a tight end with that first pick, but I wouldn't be shocked if they did.
I mean, that is an interesting conversation that we haven't had about the draft. I think for the most part, their needs are not positions you should draft in the first round. Like, it's primarily interior offensive line.
Yep.
So, like, I think edge is a very likely possibility, and that'll affect another player on this list. I think also, I don't know that they would wait on this Noah Fant decision until the draft necessarily. I think they'd probably make it ahead of that.
I can't believe Jaron Reed is already going to be 33 years old. It feels like they just drafted him, but I guess that was 8 years ago or something.
Yes, we're all very old, as it turns out. Much older than Jaron Reed, who is next on our list.
He has been surprisingly good for them, and given that he's come here twice, probably seems to like Seattle. So there's seems to me there's a reasonable chance of bringing him back. So I'll say like 55%.
Man, they're just not going to have that kind of money right now.
How much money do you think it's going to take here?
I think Jaron Reed will end up with a better deal in Seattle.
Okay.
I'm going to say 0% chance.
Wow.
Gaming the system. I'm going to say 45%. Okay, Dre Jones. Do we feel like there's any chance that he's back, or should we just pass?
This is going to be a post June 1st designation for Dre Jones, right?
Yeah, I guess you could do that and push the money over into 2025.
Well, right now it's $14 million for next season, isn't it? If it's not post, the dead cap is 14 million, which I'm not saying that they wouldn't do, but
is there a reason not to do it as opposed to June 1st? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Is there any reason not to?
I mean, it's just a take your medicine situation. And I guess it depends what else they do in terms of restructuring and that sort of thing.
That was my expectation. Is basically I think it'll be a post June 1st for Dre
do we
Jones.
think there's enough chance of him actually being on the roster to make this worth doing, or do we think he's definitely not coming back?
I'll give him 10%.
That says we should do not.
Sure, I'll be at 10 also.
We mentioned Uchenna Nwosu. It's only an 8.4 million cap savings if they move on because of the fact that his base salary is partially protected. So, what do we think the percentage chances are here?
The injuries have been really sad, but when healthy, he's a really good player, and I don't think it's worth um, the amount that they would gain by cutting him. So I hope to see him back. I'll give him 75%.
Yeah, what is the? You said it was an 8 million
It's
savings. What is the dead cap with that?
13.
13. I think they'll bring Jenna back.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason I think the argument against it would be, you've already had a pretty solid rotation at edge, and if that's a place that they think they're likely to address in the first round, maybe that room starts to get too crowded. Could even be a situation with that, partially guaranteed base salary, 6 million guaranteed as of February 10th. Could be a situation where maybe they look to trade him potentially at the time of the draft, I suppose. So
I am skeptical whether they'll be able to do that. I think there's an 80% chance, 85% chance that Uchenna-Nwosu's back.
I'm going to say 60. All right, lastly, Ernest Jones the fourth, their most prominent free agent. Laken Tomlinson is actually the free agent who played the highest percentage of snaps last season, although, probably not prominent enough to merit inclusion on this list, but a solid season for Laken Tomlinson. Shout out to him. Anyway, Ernest Jones the fourth, the report over the weekend from NFL Network that he and the Seahawks had paused negotiations, but he told reporters while confirming that after Sunday's game that he still anticipates getting something done prior to free agency. Ben?
That sounds promising. I'll say 80%.
100%. They are not letting Ernest Jones go.
You're probably right. I'm still going to say 95%.
With the way the defense transformed after he came here, I would just be so shocked.
And the way that, Mike McDonald seemed to target him in particular, I think, yeah, there's a lot of reasons to expect him to be back. So I'll say 95%. All right. It is that time. We need to go back and review our over-unders for the 2025 NFL season.
Well, just even before that, I think looking at basically the percentage chances that we're talking about, what we're talking about is almost exactly the same team.
Right.
Overall, with some very minor changes. Obviously, there's the draft picks, players like that will matter, be factors, but that's not addressing a lot of needs at the moment. I think they probably, again, need being the word that you hate. I think they need to go out and try to have a conversation about figuring out the quarterback of the future. I would be very surprised if they didn't. How about that in the draft? At least draft somebody higher than they have since David Green, right? But beyond that, like offensive line needs help. For the first round pick, you said that they don't need players. The positional needs aren't necessarily at the most valuable positions. I think cornerback is still probably a position of need. I think Mike McDonald also agrees that cornerback is probably a position of need.
Yeah, I'm not sure where we're at on Josh Jobe in terms of his performance.
I like Josh
and
Jobe,
the
but
Seahawks think if he's a long-term starter at that spot. He's someone who's a restricted free agent, so I'd say 100% chance that he's back.
I think wide receiver is like calling it a position of need isn't exactly right. But you mentioned DK is going into his last season. Tyler Lockett's moving into a different role with the team, no matter what happens. So I do think wide receiver is a position of need. A lot of offensive line is of need. I still think in the end, what they're going to end up doing.
And you're not going to draft an interior offensive lineman in the first round.
I'm not saying that they have to draft that they're going to draft an offensive lineman in the first round, but in the first 3 rounds, if they go,
yes, I think that's very plausible.
Best defensive player available, quarterback, interior offensive lineman, something like that. Are there extra draft picks relatively high this year, or?
No, I don't think they're relatively high because it's primarily comp picks. Okay. And then one of those is to replace the 4th rounder that they traded for Ernest Jones.
Got it. They have a comp pick to replace that. I could see them doing something like that. Or, I mean, I would love, obviously, Emeka Egbuka is the one who I'd want the most, probably, of an individual player. Like, if they went Egbuka, Jalen Milroe, interior offensive lineman, I would be excited. But sometimes you just have to, take your medicine and draft linemen as well.
All right, time for a look back at our own annual NFL over-under picks. We start with the Arizona Cardinals had a line of 6.5 wins. Tristan and I were over. Ben was under. Obviously, they won 8 games. and had the best point differential with Tristan's record.
Could have been
in the
9,
NFC
Cardinals.
West.
Could have been 9.
Atlanta Falcons, 9.5 wins. I was under. You two were over. They finished with 8 wins and an under here. Looks like
I still
for all
think they're
your
over. I
Kirk
take it back.
Cousins naysaying.
For all your
Baltimore-
Kirk Cousins naysaying, you're saying that I believed in. We didn't see him play.
well, you could have considered the injury anyway.
They started
Baltimore.
Penix from the beginning. They're at 10 wins.
Baltimore line of 10.5 wins. We all took the over. They won 12. That was an easy call. Buffalo, a line of 10.5 wins. There was a lot of concern about their receiver room after the loss of Stephon Diggs. They won 13 games. Ben and I took the over on this one. Tristan had an under, did not believe in Josh Allen. Notorious Josh Allen skeptic. Carolina had a line of 5.5 wins. I was over here. You two were under. They finished with 5 wins. Just after a dismal start to the season, despite Tristan continually believing that this is a playoff team if they restart the season.
Restart the season, the Panthers are in. They win the South. That's what I'm saying. The NFC South is kind of scary for next year.
The Chicago Bears had a line of 8.5 wins
God.
in so much preseason hype. We did all go under on this one.
Oh, did we? Okay.
Yeah. Everybody wins. Cincinnati Bengals, a line of 10.5 wins. We were all under on this one. They won 9 games. So, again, all correct. Cleveland, line of 8.5 wins coming off 11 the year before. We all still liked the under on this one. They won 3 games. This is hard. Dallas Cowboys, a line of 9.5 wins. We all took the over. We all made it a lock. They won 7 games.
I'm glad I wasn't the only one. I did remember I made it a lock, but it wasn't just me.
Honestly, okay. What was the line? 9.5, and that was without Dak for.
Yeah, but they were
12
not
wins?
on track to meeting the line with Dak. Like, it was a weird start to the season. I don't know.
understand how they were so much worse. It was almost exactly the same team, and Dak, he was like second in MVP voting last year, right? Their offense was great, and then it just did not happen this year.
Denver had a line of 5.5 wins. Tristan and I liked the over on this one. Ben had an under. Instead, they nearly doubled it.
I was nervous
with
about
10
that one.
wins.
Okay, I thought I went under on this. I thought I was skeptical about Bo Nix and went under. How many games did he play? He played in 8. Okay. Yeah.
Detroit Lions had a line of 10.5 wins. Were we ever so young? Were we ever so naive? We all liked the over here. None of us made it a lock. They won 15. Green Bay had 9.5 wins is a line. Ben and I went over. Tristan went under. Jordan Love skeptic. Ben also made this a lock. They won 11 games despite not playing to win their final game of the season and losing to Chicago.
And
Houston
having
Texans.
Love be injured for 4 games at the beginning of the season.
Houston Texans had a line of 9.5 wins. We all took the over. Tristan made this a lock, and I feel like this is a bad process lock, but a good outcome.
No, it's not a bad process lock because the team could have been as bad as they were and still gotten there, which is what happened.
I suppose. Indianapolis Colts had a line of 8.5 wins. We all took the under here. They won 8, so everybody wins. Jacksonville also had a line of 8.5 wins. We also all agreed on them. Unfortunately, we all took the over on the Jaguars and won 4 games. There's so much hindsight. Kansas City Chiefs had a line of 11.5 wins, and somehow I took the under. I mean, from a Pythagorean standpoint, I turned out right, but obviously they went 15-2. Tristan and Ben won that one with the over. Las Vegas Raiders, a line of 6.5 wins. We all liked the over on that one.
Wow.
They won 4 games. Los Angeles Chargers, a line of 8.5 wins. Tristan and I liked the over here. Ben had the under, a noted Jim Harbaugh skeptic. They won 11 games, hit the over. Los Angeles Rams also had a line of 8.5 wins. Tristan, noted Matthew Stafford skeptic, had the under.
Hater.
Ben and I.
There's not skepticism. It
True.
is full on hate.
It's pure on hatred.
I was gonna say if any NFC West team, if the Rams or the Niners go over, I'm going to get it wrong.
That is correct. Ben and I had the over here. We're correct. Miami Dolphins line of 9.5 wins coming into this season. I had the under on this one. You two had the over. With Tua's multiple injuries, as it turned out, they won 8 games.
Again, that was the right process. He's healthy the whole year. They probably get to 10 wins.
Yeah, and why would you ever question Tua being healthy? Uh,
Abe
Minnesota
Lucas is
Vikings.
playing all 17 next year.
Minnesota Vikings had a line of 6.5 wins, and we all took the under. They more
I
than doubled it.
I guess that was right after the JJ injury,
They hit the over by like
Mhm.
week 9.
right?
New England Patriots, a line of 4.5 wins. Tristan and I liked the over. Ben had the under and got that one despite their win in week 18. New Orleans Saints, a line of 7.5 wins. Tristan and I had the over. Ben correctly had the under as they finished with 5 wins and a coaching change. I still feel if Derek Carr had been healthy all
Oh,
year.
those first 2 weeks could just last forever.
The New York Giants had a line of 6.5 wins.
Oh,
We
God.
all liked the under here.
Okay, good.
They won 3 games. One of them against the Seahawks. I guess that's a good question. Who's the worst team who beat the Seahawks in a year where they were good? Because, like, I guess they beat the Patriots the year that, or I forget how that worked.
What?
When they were
What
2 and
Patriots?
14, when they were 2 and 14 in 1992, like they got the 2 pick and the Patriots got the 1 because they beat the Patriots the year before for one of those 2 wins. But thinking of those, like not that kind of a scenario. In years where they were actually good, who's the worst team they've lost to? New York Jets. Boy, it was September a long time ago. They had a line of 9.5 wins. Ben and I liked the under. Tristan, big Aaron Rodgers guy. Big Aaron Rodgers guy. They won 5 games.
What was their DVOA? Do you have that up?
I don't.
Okay.
It was bad. Pittsburgh, Philadelphia Eagles. Yeah, let's know we can't skip over them, unfortunately. They had a line of 10.5 wins. I took the under and made it a lock. You two both had the over. They, of course, won 14 games and had the number 2 seed in the NFC. The Pittsburgh Steelers, 8.5 wins is their line. This was the most divisive pick, maybe in the history of these over-unders, as Ben made the under a lock and Tristan made the over a lock. I just went under, did not make it a lock either way. They won 10 games despite their late losing streak. Tristan correct on this
I didn't
one.
win that as comfortably as I thought, actually.
Right, as it looked. San Francisco had a line of 11.5 wins. Tristan was, as promised, true to form, under. Ben and I were over. They won 6 games.
There we go.
Seattle Seahawks had a line of 7.5 wins. We were all over. Tristan made this one a lock.
Oh,
They won 10 games. As much discussed. Not disappointing. Tampa Bay had a line of 7.5 wins. We were all over. They won 10 games. Tennessee Titans had a line of 6.5 wins. We were all under on that one. We were all correct as they won 3 games and ended up with the number 1 pick in the draft. And finally, the Washington Commanders, a line of 6.5 wins, and we were all under. Again, that's how we felt about the Dan Quinn Cliff Kingsbury combo. They won 12 games. As embarrassing as some of those were in hindsight, Tristan got 19 of these correct. And Ben and I this year tied for number 1 with
oh,
20 correct.
I thought I beat you all. Still,
Yeah.
19 and 20.
No, very good. If you had bet on those in Vegas, you would have made 12% return on your money with Tristan's picks, 20% with Ben and I. Ben, a very narrow edge in terms of the actual return. I somehow went 0 for 2 on my locks. Tristan was, I believe, 3 for 4 on his locks. He
I
only
missed the
missed the
Cowboys, right?
Cowboys. And then Ben was, I don't think I mentioned he had, Green Bay over hit and was 1 for 3 on his locks.
How does this compare to previous years? Where do we generally?
We're generally a little bit above 500.
So this was a better year than most.
Yes, but I think we've had some good years lately.
There was one year, either last year or 2 years ago, we were amazing.
I thought we were really good last year. Yeah.
No, it wasn't last year. We all had 18, it looks like, precisely in 2023. So yeah, I guess this was a slightly better than 2023. That certainly wasn't a bad year. Let me see, 2022. 2022 was the amazing year. Ben hit 24, Tristan hit 22, and I hit 21.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah, I guess if you're headed to Vegas in the first week of September, Not
whole season, I thought I did terribly because all I can remember are the two locks. So like, oh, it must be terrible. So
same.
going better than 500, I'll take it.
Is a reminder this is not a prospectus. Past results are no guarantee of future performance. No pick is a lock.
Do you have our record in picks that we agreed on?
We went 10-6 in those ones.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm kind of surprised we didn't do even better than that.
It did feel like it at times, but as a reminder, we were all under on the Vikings and the Commanders.
Yeah.
Still pretty good. I mean, I don't know. It's a rookie quarterback, and it was a team that had just lost their starting quarterback for the season. So can kind of understand where we were coming from on those. The Packers under, I'm kind of baffled by why I picked the Packers under.
I did not go back and listen. I just looked at the spreadsheet, so I can't tell you why.
That one I'm not too sure about. Anyway, I think what we talked about overall for the Seahawks team. We'll see what happens in the offseason. Right now, we're talking about a Mariners style, fairly uneventful offseason. Hopefully not as uneventful as the Mariners, but there'll be some transact. There already has been. But I think we're talking about a team that we expect mostly to be run back. And I'm fascinated to see how right or wrong we are after year one, because obviously, John and Mike, the new regime, have proven that they're willing to change things up very, very quickly if they're not liking the results so far. So it could be a very active offseason, or it could be something very similar. But excited about following along, and mostly the entire time just talking about how excited about Damon Williams we are. Who cares about the Seahawks? Come on.
Oh, wow. Ben, do you feel more disconnected from the Huskies now that Stanford is in the ACC?
I did watch the first college football game in years, and it was the Rose Bowl. I was like, wow, Steven Sarkisian's the Texas coach. And then, yeah, Chip Kelly's in Ohio State now. This is all a whole wild world to me.
Well, Steve Sarkisian wasn't involved in that game.
Wait until you learn about the conferences.
Oh, yeah, because I turned on the Rose Bowl and it was the ASU Texas game. And then they had the end of that game, which is actually a great game.
The most shocking thing to you wasn't that Arizona State was in the playoff?
I still don't know what conference Arizona State is in. They didn't mention that part, but good for them for getting to the playoff.
They're not in the one that Stanford's in, and they're not in the one that UW is in. So
okay,
they don't exist.
A third conference, not as bad as the one that Stanford's in, but
well, look, this is always one of our favorite podcasts to record, and hopefully this year it won't be followed by the Seahawks firing their head coach a few days later. It seems very unlikely to me on this one. And Ben, thanks so much for staying up past your bedtime to join us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Very excited for the playoffs, and hopefully we get to do one of these after the playoffs have started.
That would be nice sometime. He means next year.
Oh,
yes.
I was like, what are you predicting will happen?
He means the Seahawks might make the playoffs.
There's been a lot of week 18 Seahawks recap recently.
So close. So close. Literally. Do you have any thoughts on if the Seahawks would have won? I feel like they beat. I personally think Jimmy G is a better quarterback than Matt Stafford. So you know where I'm coming from. I think they win that game either way. I think the Seahawks are winning that and making the playoffs if the Rams are trying harder. It mattered to the Rams. It's not like it didn't matter.
I don't know.
There were a lot of social media players, even outside of Stafford, there were a lot of players that didn't play.
Yeah, including their wide receivers. So, all right. Again, thanks for joining us, Ben, and thank you for listening.
Thanks.